First things first, thanks to everyone for turning out this evening. I've been asked to give a big shout out to Carl Shorten's stand in the park. Where they at? Where they at? Yep. And everyone else that's travelled to be here this evening. Yay. So it's my second gig of the year. Getting going nicely. And the content I've got for you this evening is based around my 3 Musical Truth books. It's various content from those 3 volumes. It's actually 13 years worth of research. And what I've lined up for you is a presentation dealing with the concepts of culture creation, social engineering, and mass mind control. So, in other words, just another day at the office for me. So, let's get into it. To get the ball rolling regarding the concepts of culture creation then. Can everyone hear me okay, by the way? Yeah? All right. So, a masterclass in how social engineering gets done came across my radar many years ago. And it comes from the 1960s so-called counterculture movement. So this was the hippie flower power scene by any other name, which got started in the mid-1960s. And it changed society in some major ways. It changed attitudes towards things like music, entertainment, family, sex, society generally. And whenever any kind of fad, trend, movement or scene comes along that has that kind of wide-reaching effect, you can be sure it's not occurred naturally in a grassroots organic kind of fashion, but it's occurred at the hands of those whose full-time jobs it is to make these kind of changes. So we're talking behavioural scientists, psychologists, social scientists, anthropologists, those that work for organisations such as the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, and various other groups which we'll be coming across as we go through. So the genesis for the 60s counterculture was laid in the previous decade, the 1950s, through a group of individuals known as the Beat Poets. This was the Beat generation of artists. And we've got 3 such names here who were responsible for changing societal attitudes and ways of thinking. So first off, William S. Burroughs, who was a sexual deviant and a murderer, so we're off to a good start. He killed his wife in a stunt gone wrong and didn't do a day in jail for it, so friends in high places, I would say. Then we got Allen Ginsberg, the Beat poet in the middle here. He was a paedophile apologist. He was a founder member of NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, which advocated for grown men to be able to have sex with young male children. And one of his claims to fame was he used to give presentations entirely naked. He used to enjoy doing that. So complete and utter degeneracy. So another one that belongs well to this club. And the other guy here is Jack Kerouac, another well-known author and poet. I don't have a whole lot on him, but it's only because I've not gone digging. So if I did, I'm sure I'd find something. Anyway, these were the cultural heroes of those who came to be the founders of the counterculture scene of the following decade. Also having a hand in it, I don't have a slide for it here because there's some video content missing, but would you believe it was an individual by the name of Aldous Huxley? You may have heard of him. You may have heard of the Huxley family. Eugenicists, elite family bloodline, and of course Aldous was the author of Brave New World, which was more an instruction manual than a novel for life in the 2020s. And that's who also had a hand in this whole scene. Very much a part of the counterculture scene of the 60s, besides the music and other aspects of the entertainment, which we'll get to shortly, was mind-altering drugs, and specifically LSD. Large quantities of it were getting put into the hippie communes, the music festivals, the gatherings of those times, and documentation has shown much of this occurred at the hands of those nice people at the CIA. You know, the military intelligence communities who were there to just keep us safe and represent our best interests and keep us protected from harm. Although, unfortunately, in this satanically inverted society in which we live, it's these very institutions who are responsible for harming us, who are putting into place these threats to our personal safety. But don't worry, we'll cover all that as we go on as well. So in terms of how the counterculture scene really got going in California, so the American version of it came out of San Francisco and, as we'll see, out of Los Angeles, and specifically a small neighborhood in the Hollywood Hills known as Laurel Canyon. You may have heard of it. And there was also a British version, which was largely centered around London. But the California version really got a good start in January of 1967. And this was pre-announcing what would come to be known as the Summer of Love, which kicked off in June of that year. So in January of 67, we had this event. It was called The Human Being. It's bringing in aspects of transhumanism. It's bringing in other aspects of social change and differing attitudes towards everything. And look at the cast list that we have involved in this one. Headlining is a guy by the name of Dr. Timothy Leary. Now, this guy was a Harvard professor, an academic attached to that Ivy League university, and he ostensibly got kicked out of his role for advocating the use of LSD and various other psychedelics, or what were known as entheogens, encouraging his students to go on these journeys of discovery by exploring their consciousness, altering their states of mind. So Leary, in later years, by his own admission, was an asset of the CIA. He was employed by the agency, and his entire persona was a construct. So he got gifted the phrase turn on, tune in, drop out, which became the mantra of those times. And that phrase was gifted to him by another academic, philosopher, and an advertising agency executive by the name of Marshall McLuhan. So everything was a construct. Also on the bill for The Human Being, we had a guy by the name of Richard Elpert, or Dick Elpert, and he was alternatively known as Ram Dass. That was his alter ego. He was embracing Eastern mysticism. And in the same way that Leary used to dress in robes and wear flowers around his neck and extol the virtues of Eastern mysticism and religions from that part of the world, so Dick Elpert, or Ram Dass, really took things a stage further and came up with this entire alternative construct for himself. Would you believe? Turns out to have been on the payroll of the CIA. Hard to believe, I know. Next in the cast list, we have Dick Gregory, who was a black comedian turned political activist. One of his claims to fame was that in 1975, he, along with a guy named Bob Grodin, was the first to present to the American public the Zapruder footage of the JFK assassination, which up to that point had not been seen by any members of the public. It was presented for the first time live on television in '75. Dick Gregory was one of the guys responsible for that. In his latter years, he also cropped up in the narrative involving Prince. You may remember Prince gave a television interview in 2009 on a chat show hosted by Tavis Smiley, where he started talking spontaneously about chemtrails, geoengineering. Not the sort of thing you're really supposed to bring up on a chat show if it's not part of the narrative. And Prince said that he learnt all about the geoengineering agenda, plus other conspiracy theories, from Dick Gregory. So he would appear to have been clued in on a thing or two. Dick Gregory, very shortly after Prince died, turned up dead himself in very suspicious circumstances. There's more on that in my book. We also have the aforementioned Allen Ginsberg, who was present at The Human Being, probably naked, you know. And also Jerry Rubin, who was a political activist who, along with another guy named Abbie Hoffman, became close personal associates of John Lennon during his politically active phase of the early 1970s. So this really was a key event in the Golden Gate Park of San Francisco, music coming from Santana and the Steve Miller Band.
Mark, can I just say, today's the anniversary. It's actually Saturday, January the 14th.
Wow, yeah, I never spotted that. So what's that, 56 years?
Yes.
56 years, wow, yeah. Isn't synchronicity a wonderful thing? Yeah, never spotted that one. So also, as a part of the 60s counterculture, with LSD everywhere, acid, psychedelic rock music, you had a guy who went by the name of Ken Kesey. It was Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters. And they used to go around in this brightly coloured psychedelic type bus. I think this is where the inspiration for the bus in Scooby-Doo probably came from. And they would go around all these hippie gatherings and all these music festivals and stuff and dish out doses of LSD, usually laced in punch. Guess where the LSD came from? Yep, it was the CIA. And it turns out that Ken Kesey, as well as being another asset on the payroll of the CIA, was also a subject in the CIA's MK-Ultra mind control experimentation program. He was the author of the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was later made into a film starring Jack Nicholson. And that story was all about MK-Ultra experimentation in hospitals sponsored by those nice folk in Langley, Virginia. So that's who Ken Kesey was, yet another connection into the CIA. So it starts to look, when you factor in all these connections and affiliations, as if that entire 60s scene espousing the virtues of love and make love not war and flower power and all this kind of stuff is way more of a construct which is occurring on the terms of certain interested groups and parties than it is a natural grassroots movement that just kind of grew up out of nowhere. It's either that or it started off with very noble intentions and with those sort of natural roots, but it was very quickly steered off and subverted into various desired directions. And this is the case with any kind of fad, trend, movement scene which sweeps up large numbers of people in its wake. It could never be any other way for as long as we have the present control system presiding over these dynamics. So here's Leary with his famous mantra, which is very much, you know, the watchword of those times, those heady years of the mid to late 1960s. Turn on, tune in, drop out, referring to the dropping of acid, LSD, and various other entheogens and going into altered states of consciousness. Nothing wrong with that if it's occurring on the terms of the individual and if it's entirely their own choice, their own free will decision. It becomes a problem when it's occurring on the terms of somebody else, particularly when you don't actually know who that somebody else is, who the individuals, who the groups, who the networks are concerned. This brings us to a famous quote made by Edward Bernays, which I usually bring up in my presentations because it really does help to make the point. Edward Bernays was the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, coming out of that particular long-running family bloodline, and he's credited with being the father of public relations and having invented the concept of propaganda in terms of the way it's used by corporations to affect the way they're thought of by the general public. Bernays put out a book in 1928, almost 100 years ago, simply titled Propaganda. And to paraphrase the opening paragraph of that book, he said, "We are governed, our tastes and thoughts shaped and moulded for us largely by men whose names we do not know." And that statement is as true today as it was in 1928. Nothing new under the sun. So this is Richard Elpert, who I mentioned earlier. That's him in his day job guise, in academic mode. and this is him following his makeover, having become Ramdas. Or is it rammed arse? I don't know. I hope not. This place was heavily involved in the CIA's MKUltra mind control experimentation, and specifically the study of LSD and the effects that it would have on the minds of its participants. It's known as Millbrook Mansions, and this place was owned by Billy Hitchcock Mellon, who comes out of the Hitchcock-Mellon banking dynasty. It's one of the so-called elite bloodline families in the United States. So Billy gifted this place to Dr. Timothy Leary and various other MKUltra doctors to do their experimentation there. So we might ask ourselves, what interest would an American aristocrat have in gifting over one of his properties for that kind of activity, unless they're involved in the sponsoring of it and have a vested interest in the outcome of the studies. So that went on in the mid to late 1960s. I learned a lot about how the dynamics of culture creation, lifetime actors, and social engineering work from a couple of researchers named Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill. Anyone familiar with their work? Heard the names? Only one. Wow, okay. Well, these guys had a really great podcast series several years ago called Unspun, and it came out of Jan Irvin's Logos Media platform at the time. It was known as Gnostic Media initially. And so for a few years, they collaborated and they really took a deep dive into who the key players were in those MKUltra years, and with specific regard to the counterculture. I learned about this guy, Robert Gordon Wasson. Jan Irvin had a bit of a bee in his bonnet about him. He just wanted to know everything about this guy and what he was really up to. So his day job was, he was head of propaganda for JP Morgan Bank. So we're off to a great start. But one of his extracurricular activities was that apparently he used to enjoy studying entheogens, plant medicines, and the way that they would alter the consciousness. He made a famous trip to Mexico in 1957, hung out with a bunch of the indigenous people there, and he was studying peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, and various other plant medicines. And we're asked to believe that this was a personal interest of this guy. It's just something that he liked to do on the weekends. But it seems far more likely that this was actually a precursor to what was known to be coming the following decade with the 1960s counterculture, given that the elites plan their moves years, if not decades, in advance. They know where they want society to be 30 years from now at any given time. So when Wasson made this visit in 1957 to Mexico, it would already have been decided that the following decade, in the 60s, they were going to do a number on the generation known as the baby boomers. So this is the generation that was born at the tail end of the Second World War and in the years immediately following. And they were all coming of age in the mid to late 1960s, where they were rife for manipulation by the social engineers, and they were having their perceptions of society, family, relationships, music, drugs, sex, all shaped and moulded for them by what Edward Bernays would have referred to as men whose names we don't know. Well, we know a few of them now, but back in those days, nobody did. So Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill did some delving into this famous trip to Mexico, and it turned out to be the subject of an article in Life magazine, owned by another elite banking asset, Henry Luce. And in the May 1957 edition of this publication, Wasson's trip to Mexico and what he'd apparently discovered with all these mushrooms and stuff like that was being documented. And this was gearing the American public up for what was known to be coming, getting them ready for the next stage in the agenda. What Irvin and Atwill discovered also was that that trip to Mexico officially formed a part of the CIA's MKUltra program. This document is Warson's pay requisition, titled MKUltra Subproject 58, whereby that entire trip to Mexico was bankrolled by the CIA. So he was there on official business for the agency. The amount of times the CIA has been in breach of its contract cannot be counted. And again, it's a complete inversion. The public is entrained through Hollywood movies and such to think of them as this noble, gallant organisation, keeping them safe from harm. Actually, they're the ones doing the harm. And it's no different in Britain with MI5 and MI6. We're entrained through the James Bond films and other vehicles to think of these organisations as having our best interests at heart, whereas in fact, they exist to do us harm. It's why they're there. Unfortunately, Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill then fell out. They no longer worked together. Jan Irvin accused Joe Atwill of being a CIA agent himself, but I wouldn't worry too much about it because Jan Irvin accuses everyone he's ever worked with of being a CIA agent at some point or other. It's a character flaw. This was pretty much the house band of the MKUltra, counterculture, hippie, flower power era. It's the Grateful Dead, loved by many a stoner rockhead. And fans of the Grateful Dead have always been referred to, apparently, affectionately, as deadheads. So they'll proudly proclaim, "Yeah man, I'm a deadhead." And they think it's a term of endearment. Whereas I would argue, knowing what I now do about the true sick, psychopathic, satanic nature of those who create groups such as this, that this was actually mockery, morbid, satanic mockery of the profanity of the masses, as they see it, by referring to them as deadheads and getting them to refer to themselves in that way. They do love to mock what they see as the ignorance of those they have in their crosshairs. So when it comes to the personnel of the Grateful Dead, we've got all kinds of connections here. Jerry Garcia, one of the founder members, CIA to his core, as documentation has shown. We've got Bob Weir, one of the other key members of the Grateful Dead, who rather reluctantly, on camera just a few years ago, admitted to having been in attendance at Bohemian Grove. This area of redwood forest in Northern California, where the so-called great and good and famous and powerful of the world dress up in robes and take part in this ceremony known as the cremation of care around a bonfire in front of a 40-foot stone owl. I mean, we've all done it, right? Just a standard way to spend the weekend. But we might ask ourselves what a bunch of old stoner grizzled rock stars are doing hanging out in such a place. And then we find connections into the Freemasons. Won't be the last time you hear that name this evening. Connections into the Century Club, connections into Harvard and Yale University, connections into different expressions of the American establishment politics and the Pentagon and all of this, all coming from one rock group. And so it becomes clear that the Grateful Dead didn't get into this position by any kind of accident. They were placed there, as they all are. And just before we leave the Grateful Dead, it becomes interesting to factor in a couple of their ancillary personnel. So one was a guy by the name of Alan Trist, and he was a music publisher for the Dead for a certain period in their heyday. Alan Trist's father was a guy by the name of Eric Trist, and he was one of the founder members of the Tavistock Institute of Human Affairs in London. This is a social engineering think tank which concerns itself with the shaping and moulding of culture and of value systems, the way the general public think about things. There are other groups such as SAGE, the Behavioural Insights Team, the Nudge Unit, and they've very much been in vogue these past 2.5, 3 years in terms of in training people in how to think. But Tavistock is the overall umbrella organisation that deals with all that stuff. So there's one ominous link to the Grateful Dead, and another is the fact that one of their early road managers was a guy by the name of Hank Harrison, who, as well as having been an asset of the CIA, I'm glad you're all sitting down to recover from the shock, also happens to be the biological father of Courtney Love, who was the partner of Kurt Cobain, who didn't shoot himself in 1994 at the age of 27. I personally believe that he was murdered, and many researchers feel that Courtney Love would have known a thing or two about what happened. So too would Dave Grohl, who was a member of Nirvana at the time. He was the drummer for the band in 1994 when Kurt Cobain checked out, before he went on to form the Foo Fighters. And there'll be more from Dave Grohl as we progress. So moving on from the Grateful Dead and moving on from San Francisco, where you had groups such as Jefferson Airplane, who also played a major part in that counterculture scene, largely hinged around the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, we now cross over to the aforementioned Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles. And I learned a lot about this place from this landmark piece of work by the late author and researcher Dave McGowan. The book is titled Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. How many people have read this one? Not many. Okay, well.
I just got it, I haven't read it yet.
Okay, a couple. Well, I thoroughly recommend a delve into this one, particularly as Dave McGowan is no longer with us. So this book came out in 2014, and on the 22nd of November, the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination of 2015, Dave McGowan passed away of an extremely fast-acting and aggressive form of cancer. We can make of that what we will, but he left behind this landmark piece of work. So Dave was a builder by day. He had his own construction firm, but one of his hobbies was looking into the rock music that he grew up on in the mid to late 1950s. And his interest got sparked by this neighbourhood in the Hollywood Hills, known as Laurel Canyon, and particularly the fact that within Laurel Canyon there was a covert military research base known as Lookout Mountain, which was involved in the production of propaganda wartime films on behalf of the American military, among various other activities. And prior to 1965, Laurel Canyon had no kind of affiliation to the music industry whatsoever. There were no music clubs, no recording studios, no bands ever played gigs there. But for some reason, from about 65 onwards, bands from all over the United States started getting drawn magnet-like to Laurel Canyon. And not just from the States. They were coming from Canada, they were coming from the UK, bands like The Animals out of Newcastle. So many musicians feeling the need to relocate to Laurel Canyon. So McGowan wanted to know why this was. And he started doing a bit of digging into the family backgrounds of these musicians. And what he found, pretty much without exception, was that the fathers of the musicians who were redefining culture, redefining rock music, had direct links to the American military, the Air Force, the Navy, Office of Naval Intelligence, aspects of the Defense Department, the Pentagon, government, Ivy League universities, secret societies, Freemasons. Now, I'd always considered that when it comes to rock stars, if you looked into what the fathers of these famous musicians did, you would expect to find a whole load of blue-collar, working-class jobs. I would just have expected to have found dockers, construction workers, lorry drivers, plumbers, carpenters, that kind of thing. You don't find that. What you do find is generals, admirals, diplomats, politicians, mayors, statesmen. Why would that be? The most famous example that McGowan cited is one that you've probably heard before, that of Jim Morrison, frontman of The Doors. So Jim was the poster child for the anti-establishment, anti-war generation, the baby boomers, who stood against the value system of their parents' generation. They were all about turning their back on what their parents' values stood for. So somehow we have to reconcile Jim Morrison, the fully formed, iconic poster child rock god, with the fact that his father was George Stephen Morrison, who was the Navy Admiral in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag incident, which gave an excuse for America to be springboarded into the long, protracted, bloody Vietnam War. Now, if that was an isolated example, you might be able to say, well, Jim was just rebelling against what his father stood for. But it's not an isolated example. We get so many. Frank Zappa, also thought of as anti-war, anti-establishment. His father was involved in biological weapons research at the Edgewood Arsenal military base. Frank was born there. He was a military brat. He went around various military sites all over the world. And we find this with pretty much every influential musician coming out of this area that shaped and moulded that whole 60s counterculture. Establishments, connections for days, and that's why I say that a study of this scene gives us a masterclass into how these dynamics work. Very far from the only time it's been done. There's Ken Kesey, we mentioned him earlier, looking very sane and balanced, I'm sure you would agree. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that's the story he wrote. There's his bus again. Now, also coming out of the 60s, as well as the LSD, as well as the rock music, we had differing attitudes towards things like feminism, the birth of the modern feminist movement. And that occurred at the hands of this woman. Her name was Gloria Steinem. She was the proprietor of Ms. magazine, and she is lauded as being responsible for giving equal rights to women and saying, hey, it shouldn't just be men that go out in the workplace. Women have as much right to go out there and do that as their male counterparts. And she was successful in getting a whole generation of women into the workplace, contributing to the taxation system, so a double benefit for the system. But most importantly, taking themselves out of the traditional nurturing maternal role that women had held in the family up to that point. That's what this whole 60s scene was about. It was tearing apart traditional family values. It was breaking apart the unity and the cohesion that came from the traditional family unit. Of course, it was all presented as something benign and something beneficial to the women involved, but society has never been the same since. It's no exaggeration to say that we're still feeling the ripples of the social engineering programs that were put in place in the 1960s. And we see it through this dynamic as much as any other. Oh, and by the way, Gloria Steinem turned out to be on the payroll of, as Rolf Harris used to say, can you tell what it is yet? I'm not really in the habit of quoting Rolf Harris too much. Sometimes it serves the purpose. Then we have the British side of things in the 60s. So it wasn't all coming out of California, most of it was, but there was a British counterpart to what was happening in America. And this was the avant-garde artistic scene of the mid to late 60s, very much centred around London. So to kickstart the whole thing and change the attitudes of people on these shores, you had swinging London. So Carnaby Street, David Bailey, Twiggy, all that good stuff. And then by the time 1967 had come along, the Beatles had stepped into their role as helping to push along the British version of the counterculture. So the career of the Beatles can be split into two parts, effectively. 1962 to 66, and then 66 to when they broke up. So when they first emerged, they were all about boy meets girl, pleasant love songs. They were effectively the boy band of their day. She loves you, I want to hold your hand. By the time 1966 had come along, they were starting to get more experimental with their music. This is before we even factor in the situation with Paul McCartney and the allegation that the original Paul died in September of 1966 and was replaced. That's one for another day. But it is interesting to note that the Beatles played their final live show on the 29th of August 1966 at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, that city again. And beyond that, with the exception of that rooftop concert in January of 1969 at Abbey Road Studios, they never played live again. They were only ever a studio band. Their music got more experimental, very avant-garde, occurring at the hands of their producer George Martin, but it was all going on behind closed doors, so nobody actually saw that music being produced. So we actually have no direct proof that the four Beatles even played everything that they're said to have played on these tracks. But by 1967, we had their classic, iconic album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the soundtrack to the Summer of Love. Very psychedelic, very trippy, very far out. That was the Beatles' contribution to the counterculture and helping get that pushed along on these shores. And that same year, you had McCartney, or whoever it is, giving an interview about LSD and saying, yeah, sure, you know, we've all tried it, and you've got to get with the times, and we're into all this stuff now. And I personally believe, as many other researchers do, that the Beatles were a product of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. So they were created by that organisation for social engineering purposes. I also believe that to be the case of their rivals, or the group that's said to be their rivals, the Rolling Stones. All this stuff is for a presentation of another day. It is all in my books, but I've pissed off Beatles fans, pissed off Rolling Stones fans, so I won't go any further with any other groups, but suffice to say, there's more to know here. Speaking of the Rolling Stones, they were very much in tandem with the Beatles and on side in terms of agendas being pushed. So this was their contribution to psychedelic culture. It was the album that they put out in December of '67, 6 months after Sgt. Pepper, and it was the catchily titled Their Satanic Majesty's Request. We've got a sleeve design which is very much a pastiche of that of Sgt. Pepper, in very much the same style. Very cleverly hidden into the design are the faces of the four Beatles, pretty much concluding that the two groups were working together, or at least those that controlled them. And this was the Rolling Stones' only psychedelic-themed album before they returned back to their blues-based rock. So the Stones were playing their part, and that's why I believe they were also assets of these same organisations. Nothing is organic and grassroots as we're led to believe it is. The London counterculture scene was very much built up around the avant-garde art movement of those times. What we have here is the key members of the Indica Gallery in the Mayfair area of London. We've got a guy named Barry Miles, we've got John Dunbar, in the middle is Marianne Faithfull, who was a Rolling Stones sort of girlfriend, concubine, and she was the partner of John Dunbar for a time. We've got Peter Asher, who was the brother of Jane Asher, who was the girlfriend of Paul McCartney for a large period in the 60s, and we've got Paul McCartney, or whoever it is, and these 5 individuals were partners in the Indica Gallery, which was all about pushing arcane, esoteric literature and also avant-garde art of the time. It was an art gallery and a bookstore, and it was very much in keeping with the zeitgeist of those times. Lots to know about the Asher family. Again, a major story for another day, but Peter Asher and Jane Asher's father, Dr. Richard Asher, was engaged in research into MKUltra style mind control experimentation, and specifically hypnosis and what can be achieved through placing subjects into dreamlike states and then implanting ideas into their consciousness without their conscious knowledge. And many researchers feel that Paul McCartney, who was living with the Ashers at Dr. Asher's home and laboratory in Wimpole Mews, London W1, had many of the songs which he claims to have written implanted into his subconscious as a result of Dr. Asher's work into hypnosis. Dr. Asher turned up dead in very suspicious circumstances in 1969, a short while after Paul had split with Jane Asher and got with Linda. He went missing from his family home. Then he turned up in the basement a week later and we're told he committed suicide. Nobody had thought to look in the basement before, apparently. Like I say, lots more to know about that one. Also playing their part in the British side of MKUltra were the group Pink Floyd in their earliest incarnation. In their case, coming out of Cambridge University. The original frontman in the foreground here was Syd Barrett, and his father, Max Barrett, was involved in research of a similar nature to Dr. Asher attached to Cambridge University, mind control experimentation. It's my belief, and that of other researchers, that Syd Barrett was used as a kind of mind control subject. The official story regarding him is that he did too much LSD in the spirit of the times, and it fried his brains to the point that he could no longer function as the primary singer-songwriter of that group. So he had to be removed as early as 1967, when this group were really starting to make headway into the counterculture scene of London. And that's when Dave Gilmour stepped in, and a few years after that, Pink Floyd's whole sound changed from trippy psychedelic rock to the more progressive style of rock that they're best known for. So I think the idea that Syd did too much LSD is a cover for the fact that he was a mind control experiment that went wrong. And that's the dubious early beginnings of Pink Floyd. So, as I said, nothing new under the sun. And the 60s counterculture, although it serves as a masterclass in how the social engineering gets done, is very far from the only example we have of how a major cultural movement bears all the hallmarks of having been created as a construct rather than allowed to grow and flourish on its own. And this is one that I know a bit about because I wasn't around for the 60s counterculture, but I was around for the 80s acid house rave scene. I was 18 when the second Summer of Love kicked off, so I was rife for manipulation on this one. And I think there's a clue there from the very fact that 1988 was referred to in the mainstream media at the time as the second Summer of Love, because they were telling you that what this whole scene represented was a reboot of what had gone on in the 60s for a new generation on the other side of the Atlantic. So the blueprint was the same. They wanted to mind control an entire youthful generation. They wanted to closely surveil and monitor what would happen when large groups of young people would get together in communal situations listen to certain styles of music, pull their consciousness under the influence of various mind-altering drugs, and come together in ceremonial dance-type scenarios. So in the 60s, it was LSD. In the 1987-88 version, it was MDMA or ecstasy, E. In the 60s, it was psychedelic rock and folk rock and these other different forms of music. In the 80s, it was the emergence of electronic dance music in its very early, crude form. In the 60s, it was hippie communes and music festivals like the Monterey Pop Festival and Altamont and events such as this. And in the 80s, it was acid house, warehouse parties, raves in fields, and then later the superclubs of the 90s. This whole scene spearheaded the whole thing. So it's my belief that the social engineers decided to just upgrade the whole thing and apply so much of what they'd learned in the 60s to a British crowd in the late 80s. So the official story of how that whole scene got going has long since passed into myth and legend. So the idea is there were 4 young London DJs who went out to Ibiza, the spiritual home of Balearic dance music culture, and they underwent this amazing transformative experience where they dropped ecstasy and they partied open air under the stars to music played by a DJ named Alfredo, and they underwent this epiphany. And they realised that this is how music should be, this is what young people coming together in a spirit of unity should be all about, and it didn't half help to have the whole experience enhanced by being under the influence of ecstasy, this amazing new drug that just seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. A bit like the LSD did in the 60s, you know. Much harder to prove where all the ecstasy came from, but it's my personal contention that a lot of it would have been coming out of MI5 and MI6, British military intelligence, because this was an intel exercise. So these 4 DJs that went out to Ibiza were a guy named Johnny Walker, not the Radio 2 DJ, a different one, Nicky Holloway, who was a well-known party promoter and DJ on the London scene, Paul Oakenfold, and Danny Rampling. This is a young Danny Rampling enjoying himself back in 1988. Now, I've since got to know Danny Rampling very well, because over the course of the past 3 years, he's stood up, stuck his head above the parapet, unlike pretty much any other well-known DJ out there, and most well-known musicians, in standing up for the natural rights and freedoms of all of us, and in opposing tyranny. So, got much respect for the guy, and I consider him to be genuine and sincere. So he was one of the pioneers of this scene. I would like to have a conversation with him more about what went on in those incredible days in the late 80s. But the other DJ involved in this scene was Paul Oakenfold. And it was Oakenfold's birthday that these 4 went out to celebrate in Ibiza. Oakenfold's career has since gone stratospheric. So from being a relatively humble London DJ on the scene, face around town, he is now scoring Hollywood movies. He's relocated to the United States. He became the first DJ to start selling out casinos and hotels in Las Vegas in the way that the Rat Pack and Elvis Presley used to back in the day. Now DJs are doing that, and that was instigated by Oakenfold, and he's DJ'd in locations like the Great Wall of China and Stonehenge. Not the average kind of scenario that any old DJ find themselves in, but the kind of situation you can find yourself in if you've become an asset to the system and you've done a job in a very good way for them. Those are the kind of rewards that you tend to get. So I suspect that Paul Oakenfold was the kingpin behind getting this whole acid house movement going in the UK. There had to be a story as to where it all came from. And this myth, this legend, I believe, was cooked up to explain all of that. But I still maintain that it was an exercise in social engineering and it was military grade. There's Oakenfold. Here's the record label that he set up in the early 1990s, Perfecto, and we have a very familiar hand signal going on. I've studied quite a few of these as part of my work. You have various calling cards which denote membership of the club. You're down with the key movers and shakers. You get pyramids, you get the so-called Baphomet horned hand sign, you get the one eye symbolism, and you get this, which is the 666 sign. It's supposed to denote a 6 with the 3 fingers showing that it's to the power of 3. So it's 666 signalling. Don't know if you've noticed, but it's a number that seems to be much favoured by the so-called elite control system that we have. They do like placing their little calling cards in plain sight, and they do like letting you know who their assets are. So here we've got a batch of ecstasy pills from their heyday in the late 80s, early 90s. And what used to happen was the pills would get engraved with various sigils. And this was, on the one hand, a way of tracking and monitoring which grades of pills became the most popular and what kind of effects they had on the young people that were taking them. But also I'm sure there was some sigil magic going on as well, because symbols carry energetic frequency and resonance, and they have meaning. And what I think was happening with the hippie scene of the 60s and the acid house scene of the 80s, and going forward to the club culture that we now have, electronic dance music as a major movement, popular all over the world, young people going out every single weekend and dancing away to electronically produced music, is a reawakening of primal states of being. So I think it was recognised by the anthropologists that they have on board that there's a natural inclination within humans towards wanting to get together, particularly among young people, in a spirit of unity, engaging in ceremonial dance to rhythms, rhythmic beats, under the influence of conscious altering substances. And what we have going on today is merely a modern rendering of something that's been with humanity for untold generations. The problem, as I mentioned earlier, is when all of this occurs on the terms of somebody else, when it's not coming from you. So these hordes of young people that partake in these activities every weekend aren't doing it on their own terms. They're having the terms laid out for them, but they don't realise it because it's done covertly and under the radar by those who specialise in manipulating the human psyche. They know exactly how to do it, they've been doing it forever, and safe to say they don't have humanity's best interests at heart, especially when it comes to younger people. When you get to my kind of age, you're a bit grizzled, you're a bit jaded, you've seen a thing or two, you've learnt a lesson or two, or you're supposed to anyway. But when you're 18, 20, you know, you're green, you're wet behind the ears, you're all wide-eyed and enthusiastic, and you're a social engineer's dream. Absolutely rife for being shaped and moulded. And so this was the acid house generation. Other key figures from those days include some very famous DJs. Pete Tong, who's a guy that I used to look up to, who was a big inspiration for me as a radio and club DJ, but I didn't know then some of the stuff that I know about him now. He's an MBE for a start, so he's been rewarded with a nice little gong for services rendered. Here he is with Sir Mick Jagger. They were both born in the same Dartford hospital, apparently. And Sir Mick has certainly made his contribution to pushing forward the odd agenda or two. Here's Pete getting his badge of honour from the palace. And here's his Twitter page, where he's proudly crowing about being an MBE. And he describes himself as the Pied Piper of dance. So what did the Pied Piper of legend do? He led astray all the young children from a town away from their parents to their ultimate doom, right? So it's not really a title to be proud of, I would claim. But Pete describes himself as the Pied Piper of dance. Is that what his role is? Is he a gatekeeper? Has he been rewarded for a job well done? He's been the BBC's go-to man for dance music for the past 32 years. BBC Radio 1, longest serving DJ on that radio station. These things don't happen by accident. He had a club night in Ibiza many years ago called Wonderland. Pete also relocated to Los Angeles, where he lived, very close to Laurel Canyon for many years, and Wonderland Avenue is one of the main thoroughfares through Laurel Canyon. Also, the Alice in Wonderland stories from Lewis Carroll, paedophile, by the way, as well as an author, are known triggers in mind control programming. These words don't get bandied about by accident. And here we have something altogether more sinister, some other very influential DJs within the field of electronic dance music, all spearheaded by that early acid house rave scene, the explosion in dance music and club culture which occurred in the 90s and has continued to this day, was spearheaded by names such as Sasha, Paul Oakenfold, the aforementioned, Pete Tong and Carl Cox. While Danny Rampling has been out there at freedom rallies in London and turns up at various activist meetings, Carl Cox, his contemporary, has been making ads for the NHS, taking a paycheck for saying, come on guys, the only way we can get the club scene and the festival scene back to normal is if we all take what the Sheep Farm boys call an arm spear, a 3-dart finish. When you've been Britney speared, you know. I'm so used to censoring the V word online that I find myself doing it all the time now. Vaccine! There, I said it. So Carl's been pushing that, and in this essential mix coming out of Radio 1, in the 90s, this was sometime in the mid-90s, we have a barcode on the forehead. Remind you of anything? The so-called Mark of the Beast from the Book of Revelation, which talks about no man may buy or sell without first bearing the mark of the beast on his wrist or on the forehead. A barcode 30 years ago, foreshadowing what's coming in now with this push for digital IDs. That scene and these individuals were pushing this all those years ago. Here's Carl with some more imagery, pyramids and all kinds of other stuff. Here he is with some transhumanist sort of imagery going on as well. Carl Cox is reportedly the highest paid DJ in the world now, worth multiple hundreds of millions. So he's certainly been well rewarded for his part. And actually he grew up around here, Carl Shorten. That's his old stomping ground. I hope none of his family are in. And he's got this very interesting logo, which looks very much like a winged sun disk of Egyptian mythology. So there's sort of occult signalling going on there. And in the two C's here, you've got what appear to be serpent-like designs. And of course, CC, being the third letter of the alphabet, equates to 33. But I'm sure that's just a coincidence. Paul van Dyk, a German DJ out of Berlin, very responsible for pushing the form of electronic dance music known as trance. What's in a name? Giving it the old horned hand sign here. And here's a very interesting logo that Paul van Dyk has been rocking for a very long time. This appeared on his album sleeves some years ago, and I couldn't work out what this sigil represented. And then during the course of my research, I happened to come across the logo here on the right. This is an antiquated symbol for British military intelligence, MI5, that was used from the 1950s to the 1970s. You've got a pyramid with two corners cut out down the bottom and a capstone with an all-seeing eye in it. And when you flip the Van Dyke logo up, it becomes very similar in part to this old military intelligence one. So I wonder if that would have been a clue. And I think that's a pretty good point at which to take a midway break. So let's crack on with part two then. So to recap, in part one, I pissed off hippies and acid house ravers. So let's see who we can cover in part two. We're continuing to talk about social engineering. And remember what I said in part one about how any fad, trend, movement, scene which sweeps up large numbers of people in its wake and controls their behaviours, the way they speak, the way they dress, can be shown to be a construct. So it is with punk rock. Sorry, punk rockers, but, you know, I don't make it this way. I just report on it. So it does turn out to be the same case with the punk scene coming out of the UK in the mid-1970s, which to a large extent had its genesis in the scene coming out of New York a few years earlier, and a consistent factor between the New York and the London scenes, despite the fact that both of them grew up around the Chelsea districts of Manhattan and London respectively, was an individual by the name of Malcolm McLaren. So he spent some time managing the New York Dolls before he came back to Britain and got involved with the Sex Pistols, who were the poster children for that whole movement when it got going sort of end of 75, going into 76. And like the Beatles before them, the Sex Pistols were effectively a boy band. They were certainly pieced together in the same way that somebody like Boyzone or One Direction was. Malcolm McLaren was the Svengali, you know, the mastermind behind that group, and he sort of pieced it together by plucking the members from various different areas. So we had Sid Vicious, better known, well, his original name was John Simon Ritchie before he renamed himself Sid Vicious, named after Johnny Rotten's pet hamster, whose name was Sid. And it bit him once, and he said, "Oh, Sid's really vicious." And that's how he got his artist name. But Sid Vicious's big claim to fame is the fact that his parents met when they both served in the British Army. You can't get much more punk rock than that, right? And his father also spent some time serving as a Beefeater guardsman outside Buckingham Palace. So not quite the sort of punk rock parental background that you might expect. Like I was saying in part one, all these counterculture musicians, I would have expected to have found fathers with working class jobs, but you never do. And the same is so true of the punk and new wave scenes, coming out of both Britain and America. And there's a lot of crossover between those two scenes, as we'll see. So the other prominent member of the Sex Pistols, as it was pieced together by McLaren, was of course Johnny Rotten, John Lydon. In his autobiography titled Anger is an Energy, John Lydon wrote of how, just prior to finding fame with the Sex Pistols, he used to attend kinky late-night sex parties at the House of Commons, where he saw various famous politicians in compromising positions with prostitutes and rent boys. What Rotten doesn't explain is what he himself was doing there in the first place. But it's a pretty ominous background for a punk musician, and we just keep getting these connections back to the establishment. Malcolm McLaren becomes an interesting figure to study in his own right. We'll get on to him. But something else which I found of great value from those Unspun podcasts from Jan Irvin and Joe Atwill was when they looked into the whole punk and new wave scene as a follow-up to the work that they'd done with the counterculture. And a really good place to start with any fad or trend or scene is to think about the name of it, the etymology. Where did it come from? So when it comes to the punk scene, we would do well to consider what the word punk actually means. And I think the definition that really puts it into perspective is the one down here, where It defines a punk as a young man used as a sexual partner by another man, especially in a prison. People might like to think about that one and keep it in mind the next time they consider themselves a punk. So I think we had more morbid mockery of the fans going on there with the naming of this genre, in the same way that Grateful Dead fans were referred to as deadheads because that's how the controllers saw them. So it was with punks. The name means a worthless person, effectively. So here are the two key members. Sid Vicious turned up dead on the 3rd of February 1979 at the ripe old age of 21 of a heroin overdose allegedly administered by his mother, Anne Beverly, who herself was an addict. Lots more to know about the story. I go into this one in Musical Truth Volume 2, where I take a deep dive into the whole punk and new wave scene. And a few months before that, Sid had reportedly stabbed to death his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen. We'll get on to that shortly as well. So here we have Malcolm McLaren, the maverick behind the Sex Pistols, and then by default the entire British punk music scene, pictured with Vivienne Westwood, recently departed. No relation to Tim, as far as I know. We'll be getting on to him. And they were partners in the fashion retail store known as Sex, coming out of the King's Road, Chelsea, London, which is where the Sex Pistols are said to have been spawned from, and which was very influential in the whole way that the punk scene looked. This was the fashion element. And like I said, when you have any kind of scene which dictates the way people dress and behave and identify, as well as whatever music they listen to, you can be sure that Edward Bernays' men, whose names we don't know, have a finger in the proceedings. So back to Sid Vicious. Here he is with his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen. She turned up dead on the 12th of October, which coincidentally is the birthday of the notorious British occultist Aleister Crowley, in 1978. At the ripe old age of 20. She was stabbed to death in the Chelsea Hotel in Manhattan, New York. We'll get onto that venue shortly. The blame for it was pinned on Sid. He's said to have been in a heroin-induced haze, and he was out of his mind, and he stabbed her up. There was the movie Sid and Nancy, starring Gary Oldman and Chloe Webb, that you might have seen, directed by Alex Cox, that came out in the 80s, which depicted this scenario. Again, I take a deep dive into this in Volume 2, and I personally feel there's a lot more to this story than meets the eye. And I personally doubt that Sid was responsible for the death of Nancy. But that's kind of by the by. Both of them were dead by February 79, and that effectively spelt the end of the Sex Pistols, whose career only really lasted about 18 months. But their job was to springboard the whole punk movement in the UK, which replaced that which had been there before, progressive rock effectively, and older styles of rock music. The mantra that was heard at the time among the young generation that were in the crosshairs of punk was that these old rock dinosaurs were no longer relevant. It was the kind of acts you saw on the old grey whistle test, and they didn't represent what young people were into. The music scene needed a kick up the arse, it needed revitalising, and that's what punk was there to do. And once the Sex Pistols had gone their way, a whole bunch of other groups had come along in their wake, and that spawned the styles that followed, effectively new wave, and then other genres such as two-tone, and then eventually the new romantics. So it's more scenes and fads and movements that are being created, and I would argue that they're all being created by these same groups, these same agencies that we encountered earlier. The fans believe that they've found something which speaks to them, which represents their generation, and most of them would be horrified at the suggestion that they're not the grassroots, natural, organic things they perceive them to be. But once you've studied how social engineering gets done and what lifetime actors are, it puts a very different slant on things. And I'm about 14 years deep in this style of research, and I just keep seeing the same patterns, the same trends emerging time after time. A lifetime actor, by the way, is a term that was coined by the aforementioned Joseph Atwill. He was the author of Caesar's Messiah and various other books, and it speaks to somebody who is in the public eye, so they're known, they have a profile, they're a household name to the point that most people you could mention them to would say, oh, I know who that is. So they're thought of as one thing or another. So they could be a Hollywood actor, they could be a famous politician, they could be a business leader, Richard Branson, Bill Gates, somebody like that. They could be a musician. The point is, everyone knows who they are. And if you've achieved that level of fame and familiarity, you won't have achieved it on your own. You won't have achieved it through hard work and crossing your fingers for good luck. It never happens that way. You cannot fill one of those positions unless you've been chosen for it, unless you've been slotted into place by those who can make these kind of careers happen, or unless you're born into the right, read wrong, family. So much of it is down to bloodline families, new generations of the same families going way back into antiquity who are given these public roles. A couple of examples on the way. So that's Sid and Nancy. And this is the Chelsea Hotel where Nancy met her demise. This is a Gothic building, Victorian era, in Midtown Manhattan, the Chelsea district, and it has a very ominous history. I've taken a deep dive into this one. A few examples. So many poets, writers, musicians, actors, and famous people of one type or another have, at one time or another, holed themselves up in the Chelsea Hotel. Why? What is it about this place? Look at some of the names. Arthur C. Clarke wrote 2001 A Space Odyssey there. Beat poets Allen Ginsberg, we met him earlier, and Gregory Corso were residents. Jack Kerouac wrote his novel On the Road in its rooms. Playwright Arthur Miller wrote The Chelsea Effect to document his time there in the early 1960s. The writer Dylan Thomas was staying there when he's said to have died of pneumonia on the 9th of November, which is 9/11, in 1953. Charles R. Jackson, author of The Lost Weekend, committed suicide in his room on the 21st of September, the autumn equinox of 1968. But others to have called the Chelsea home at some point or other include the occultist Harry Everett Smith, who died in its room 328 in 1991. There's a lot of death in this place, have you noticed? Stanley Kubrick, Ethan Hawke, Dennis Hopper, Eddie Izzard, Uma Thurman, who married Ethan Hawke actually, Elliot Gould, Jane Fonda, and Russell Brand, among many others. Punk's D.D. Ramone wrote a book, apparently fictionalised, where he talks of groups in robes holding occult rituals in the hotel's basement. Other musical links include Madonna's residency at the Chelsea in the early 1980s and her return in 1992 to shoot photographs for her book Sex in room 822. The same room attracted Taylor Momsen's band, The Pretty Reckless, for a more recent photo shoot. British dance artist La Rue shot one of their music videos at the hotel, as did Depeche Mode's Dave Gahan for his song Saw Something. The Grateful Dead, Tom Waits, Patti Smith, Iggy Pop, Jeff Beck, Dee Ramone, Phil Lynott, Cher, Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Alice Cooper, Janis Joplin. Those previous four names were all connected to Laurel Canyon, by the way, hung out there. Bette Midler, Pink Floyd, Jimi Hendrix, Canned Heat, and Leonard Cohen all spent time there. Why? in the latest book, I've got a story detailing Leonard Cohen being an asset of British, American and Israeli military intelligence, as reported by his girlfriend Anne Diamond, who I'm going to be interviewing for my Good Vibrations podcast very soon. Listen out for that one. The Chelsea itself has been the subject of many movies, including the sex thriller 9.5 Weeks, the Japanese horror Hotel Chelsea, 2001's Chelsea Walls, and the 2008 documentary Chelsea on the Rocks. In an even more intriguing link, meanwhile, several survivors of the Titanic are said to have stayed for some time after the 1912 disaster. Well, really, it was the Olympic, but that's another story. As the hotel is close to Pier 54 dock, where the liner is supposed to have arrived. And Elvis Costello, who was a part of the whole sort of post-punk new wave scene, had a song called I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea, which is always assumed to have meant he didn't want to go to Chelsea in London. But I think he might have been talking about the Chelsea Hotel in Manhattan. And judging by that lot, I'm not bloody surprised. This family are the Copelands. You may have heard this story before, but I often tell it because, like the Jim Morrison one, and who his dad was, the Navy Admiral, it really helps to illustrate a point. So there was a patriarch to the Copeland family who was a guy by the name of Miles Axe Copeland III. He was a CIA asset. He was a career guy with the agency, had various postings around the world. He had 3 sons who were all born in the American military hospital in Beirut, which is a major CIA stronghold. This is them. They were all put to use in the music industry. We have Ian Copeland, now deceased. In the middle, you might recognise Stuart Copeland, the drummer with the group The Police. And over on the right is Miles Copeland Jr., who was the sort of leader of these 3 sons. So this family very much had a controlling stranglehold over the whole punk and new wave scene coming out of both Britain and America. They split their time between the 2 countries. So they had a holding company which sort of took care of all their business affairs in the music industry. And it was known as Copeland International Artists, or CIA. So it's not as if we're not given the opportunity to know what's going on. They do tend to like placing the odd clue here and there. So these 3 also had a booking agency whereby they would book gigs for the major bands on that whole post-punk new wave scene. And it was known as Frontier Booking International. They also had a record label through which they put out much of this material, known as International Records Syndicate. And of course, their house band, with Stuart as the drummer, was The Police. As in, they were there to police the other groups on the scene. The Copelands were so influential that they had a show all of their own on the MTV network where they would only showcase bands signed to their label or their booking agency. That's how powerful they were. So we had The Police with Sting, as in a sting operation. What's a sting operation? It's one you never see coming. It takes you by surprise. So it's not as if we weren't being told. More connections into the establishment. I mean, the punk scene really rivals that counterculture hippie scene in terms of establishment affiliations. Here's another example. 2 of the members of the Detroit 1960s proto-punk group MC5, Motor City 5, Wayne Kramer and Michael Davis, were inmates at the Federal Medicine Center in Lexington, Kentucky, known colloquially as the United States Narcotic Farm. Although it's described as a federal prison for inmates requiring medical or mental health care, it's also one of the key hospitals involved in the CIA's, steps back in amazement, MKUltra drug experimentation program. William Burroughs attended the same institution. MC5 were managed for a time by fellow poet and political, and we'll never know what the rest of it says. Because it's cut off and I can't remember. But it's in volume 2 if you're that interested. And here we have another one. This was sent in to me by a researcher by the name of Masonic Youth, and it links a punk rocker with a prominent politician. Pete Wentz of the group Fall Out Boy turns out to have a maternal grandfather who served as the US ambassador to Sierra Leone and was also a cousin of former US Secretary of State Colin Powell. It's Colin Powell really, but it's pronounced colon because he's full of shit. These bloodline connections just never end. As I said, it's all about the families that you're born into, and this can have a very strong bearing on the sort of career that's gifted to you, particularly when it comes to entertainment. Here's another couple. These are Tina Weymouth and Chris Frantz, and they were members of the group Talking Heads, new wave group out of New York. David Byrne was the front man. He's got some strange connections, but so do these two. And they were a husband and wife unit. Let's find out a bit more about them. Jan, who is Tina Weymouth's brother, their father, Ralph Weymouth, was a Vice Admiral of the US Navy and a Master of the Freemason Grand Lodge of Maine. Their great-grandfather, meanwhile, was Anatole Lebras, known as the Bard of Brittany, a highly regarded folklore poet and lecturer at Harvard and Yale universities. Yay, punk rock. Anatole married Mabel Davidson, the sister to Henry Pomeroy Davidson, which brings a link to the Yale secret society Skull and Bones. Henry was a senior partner of the banking monolith J.P. Morgan, as Robert Gordon Wilson was, who we met earlier, worked with the Astor Place Bank and was instrumental in the creation of the Federal Reserve System, attending the notorious 1910 meeting at Jekyll Island, though Wikipedia describes him as a philanthropist. But Wikipedia also described the Rothschilds and Bill Gates as philanthropists, so I wouldn't read too much into it. Astor was the family bloodline that David Cameron married into. His wife Samantha comes out of the Astor, American elite bloodline family. David Cameron turns out to be a cousin of not only Boris Johnson, and therefore the Queen, but also Kim Kardashian. And this is by Cameron's own admission. In a Daily Mail article in 2010, he told the interviewer that he's a distant cousin of Kim Kardashian. So now you know why she's famous. It's all to do with the family bloodlines. My books are full of them. Dave McGowan put me onto all this stuff, and when you know what you're looking for, you find these connections everywhere. You come to realise none of these people are famous on their own merits. There are so many more talented musicians, actors, business leaders than these people, but they don't stand a chance of making it successful and famous because they just weren't born into the right families. And you wouldn't want to be, not with this lot. Dave Grohl, so I mentioned we'd be coming back to him. By way of a great example, he was in a hardcore punk band out of DC named Scream. His father, James Harper Grohl, worked in politics as an assistant to Robert A. Taft Jr. Robert's father was William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States, and his father was Alfonso Taft, a founder of Skull and Bones. During John Kerry's presidential campaign in 2004, Dave Grohl joined the trail and dedicated the album In Your Honor to the former Skull and Bones man. Yeah, rock and roll. So John Kerry is a cousin of George W. Bush, who were political opponents in the 2004 American presidential election. So the American public were being asked, who do you want to be your next president? This representative of a particular bloodline family who's out of Skull and Bones at Yale, or this representative of the same bloodline family who's also out of Skull and Bones at Yale? Ain't democracy great? Thank God we live in free countries, eh? What a nightmare living in a dictatorship where your leaders are chosen for you. Wouldn't want that. So that's who Dave Grohl is. He was in Nirvana, as I mentioned, in the Kurt Cobain days, and there's lots more to know about him as well. In a separate presentation that I do, I go much further into Dave Grohl, who seems to have a particular fondness for the number 666. Just keeps cropping up in his backstory. No genre is left untouched, not when it affects huge numbers of people. And so it is with hip-hop culture, rap music, which I know a lot about. I was a radio and club DJ, specialising in that form of music for many years. And I used to love rap and hip-hop back in the days when it made sense. You know, you've got to go back sort of 1990s and backwards to find any decent material there. These days, it's merely being used to push agendas and to brainwash a new young generation, Gen Z, I believe they're called these days. But here we have two genres meeting. So we had a record put out in the mid-80s called World Destruction, and it came from John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, in combination with Africa Bambaataa. So Malcolm McLaren, Sex Pistols manager, struck up a friendship with Africa Bambaataa, who's known as one of the three founding fathers of American hip-hop culture. So you've got Grandmaster Flash, who's credited with inventing turntablism, the use of using turntables as musical instruments to carve out rhythms through scratching and such. Also Kool Herc, who's said to have pioneered the idea of DJs on sound systems mixing up records from two turntables, and Africa Bambaataa, who's said to have pioneered the whole culture of hip-hop, bringing together the lifestyle elements of it. Well, unfortunately, Bambaataa fell out of favour a few years ago after being revered as a hero of the scene. Two men came forward in 2016 and accused him of having sexually molested them when they were minors and members of his Universal Zulu Nation organisation, which now appears to have been run along the lines of a sort of mind control sex cult. And in the wake of those accusations, many more have come along against Bambaataa as well. So he turns out to be not quite who we thought he was, and so another cultural hero gets tarnished, and along with him, the culture and the entire art form that he helped to inspire. This is why a favourite mantra of mine is that you really should have no more heroes, because you don't really know who these people are when they get served up to you. Here's another one. Tim Westwood, DJ, again, someone that I used to look up to back in the days when I got started in the game. You might be aware there were a couple of BBC documentaries on him last year where various women accused him of predatory sexual behaviour. One woman said that she was 14 years of age when he basically sexually molested her. And these claims, these accusations, go back 40 years. Police are apparently investigating, but I'm not holding my breath for any sort of dramatic outcome to this one. Adam and the Ants, I mentioned them earlier. They were managed very early on by Malcolm McLaren before they found fame, and there's stuff to know about Adam's father. Real name Stuart Goddard, that was Adam Ant's name, and his father, Alfred Leslie Goddard, was jailed for 2 years in 1987 for sexually preying on young runaway boys. Is it just me, or is there a pattern emerging here? And his name cropped up during investigations into an alleged Westminster paedophile child murder ring in the wake of the Jimmy Savile scandal, with suggestions that he had been a procurer of child victims. The Daily Mail reported in 2015 that Goddard Sr. had been a member of a network which included Sidney Cook, who was later convicted of the sadistic gang rape and killing of a teenage boy. And Cook was also an associate of Savile. We're told that Stuart Goddard Adamant has suffered from bipolar disorder, and this has been used to explain his erratic and unpredictable behaviour. But something else that could explain that would be Adam having been used as a mind control test subject along the lines of Syd Barrett and so many others. And I suspect that's what's really going on there. The whole new romantic scene, this was one of the movements which came along in the wake of punk in the late 70s, early 80s, very much centred around the Blitz Club in Covent Garden, which is where, similar to all those counterculture acts gravitating towards Laurel Canyon, and all these groups getting put together and all these alliances being formed there, when it came to this London scene, it was all centred around the Blitz Club. And there were several key characters involved. One of them is Steve Strange, pictured here with Rusty Egan. These two were the promoters of the Blitz Club, which is where all these new romantics would congregate. And groups such as Spandau Ballet and Early Adam and the Ants and Culture Club and Ultravox and Visage, so many of these groups would come out of that scene. So we've got Steve Strange here, real name Steve Harrington, which is the name of one of the characters in the Netflix TV show Stranger Things, incidentally. Steve Strange, Stranger Things, could be a connection. But he's better known as Steve Strange. He's rocking some black and white mind control trigger symbolism here. Steve Strange's father was very high up in the British military, came out of Wales, and Steve Strange died very suddenly in some very suspicious circumstances a few years ago in his 50s. There seems to be a lot of it around. So a bit more on him here. A one-time heroin addict. This is Steve Strange, who was the frontman of Visage. He was in that group with Midge Ure of Ultravox fame. Suffered a nervous breakdown, the son of a British Army paratrooper, became a prominent promoter in London clubland, died, here we go, in 2015, aged 55 of a heart attack, so he's well ahead of his time, in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Died of coincidence. Here's a young Boy George, who was the coat check attendant at the Blitz Club before he found fame. Got a bit more on him as well, usually in the form of a video, which I'll show at this point. The video is missing, so I'll explain what goes on. In the video to the breakthrough hit for Culture Club, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me?, which came out in 1982, introduced the world to Boy George, you get scenes shot in various parts of London, and you have captions coming up on the screen to tell you where they are. So one scene takes place in the Gargoyle Club in Soho in 1936. The next scene, according to the caption, takes place in 1957 in Dolphin Square Health Club, Pimlico. Dolphin Square is a location which has been implicated in paedophile rings involving various prominent MPs, most notably Leon Britton, who was Home Secretary in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. So what possible reason could there be for a video starring Boy George, Culture Club, being set in Dolphin Square, Pimlico, where all this stuff went on? Then we have Duran Duran, another big group in the new romantic scene. There's got to be a reason why they were arguably the biggest band to come out of Britain in the 1980s, at least in the first part of it. Have we found the clue when we look at who the members of the group like socialising with? So the main driving force behind Duran Duran would not be the singer Simon Le Bon. I would suggest it was this guy, known as Nick Rhodes. Here he is socialising with Nat Rothschild, son of Baron Jacob Rothschild from that family, plus Ghislaine Maxwell. Need we say any more? If you can judge a man by the company he keeps, What does that tell us about him? Then we have the wedding of Jessica de Rothschild, who was the daughter of Evelyn, sadly passed away a few months ago. I'm sure we were all deeply saddened. Turns out that Simon Le Bon and his wife Yasmin were present at this wedding. Any old rock star gets invited to Rothschild weddings, don't they? Or is it only those who are in the club? So, summing up really, the overall central theme of this presentation and most of the work that's in my books can be summed up with these statements. When you learn about how lifetime actors and culture creation work, the question becomes, are you happy you were duped and taken into confidence by these people, and would you like more of it? Or are you rather hacked off that you were treated as such easy fodder, rife for manipulation, and now that you understand how the game is played, do you resolve to never be fooled in the same way again? There's no shame in admitting that you were bamboozled. All of us are from the earliest age. The dignity comes from acknowledging that it happened and knowing better for next time. There's a reason why the phrase, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, came around. It speaks to this dynamic. So, by the way, did the famous record by the group The Who. Not Ted Ross's lot, Pete Townshend's lot. Won't Get Fooled Again. That song is about culture creation and social engineering. Take a look at the lyrics. They're talking about how we won't get fooled again. We're not going to fall for the same tricks. That's the resolve that we have to have. The good news is, I would say, we're making headway. Because a few years ago, it would not have been possible for me to stand up here and give a talk of this nature, because this information just wasn't available to the extent that it is now. But so many people that I speak to on my travels now know how these dynamics work. They know that you don't get to be famous and influential and successful on your own terms. It's never down to talent and good luck and hobnobbing and networking with the right people. It's down to being placed there because you've shown yourself to be willing to do whatever it takes to get that fame and fortune, and you'll push any agenda that you're asked to push and be complicit with any agenda that you're instructed to. Witness the huge number of celebrities and famous people these past 3 years that haven't deviated one iota from the official version of everything and have all been singing from the same hymn sheet and therefore letting you know where their allegiances lie and who controls them. Or you're just born into one of these families where you have very little choice in the matter. It's one or the other for the most part. Going back to Jan Irvin again, guesting on an episode of the Corbett Report, he once remarked, "It's my duty, having discovered that I was mind-controlled myself, to put this information out there to help others. And they may hate me for it in the interim. But I think that the people who take the time to actually read the information and look at it closely will find it very liberating. Because it's much easier to spend a few hours or days or weeks researching facts than it is to spend a lifetime believing lies. Who wants to do that?" As I say, the good news is I feel this is a separate presentation actually, but it equally makes the point. I feel that we are making steps in the right direction, and I feel that we are heading towards a point where the old tricks, the old lies, the old manipulations just aren't going to cut it anymore, because too many people are going to know better. We can all play our part in that process by sharing information of this nature as widely as we can to anyone that will listen. And as time goes on, we will get to where we need to be, and these old tricks just ain't going to work anymore. Thanks for listening.